And it matters in a couple of ways. It isn't just that global change works its way through economies and societies and ends up the buck stopping somewhere in a real place with real people. That happens. But places aren't just on the end of this line where changes always happen out there. And all we can do in here is to somehow cop it, to adapt to it, to adopt the good bits and try and cushion the worst bits. And that's a very strong and prevailing attitude among a lot of commentators about what globalisation's about, that there's really no alternative to it. But on the other hand, places do stuff in their own right. And the food security area is one area where that's really a very important issue. People are already doing things at the local scale, and those things get translated to the national scale, and from there they actually change the kind of globalisation that we're getting. So I can't believe that globalisation is just out there and we have to adapt to it or adopt it, because things happen in places, as Philip said. And by the things we do in places, by the responses we give to those embedded lives of people, we can actually change this thing called globalisation. So geography goes both ways. Geography matters. We've looked then at the domestic impacts of economic realignment. The geographically uneven impact between people and places is what I want to focus on. But rather than go through lots and lots of statistics, and there are quite a few in the PowerPoint that I know is coming up, probably the best thing I could do with the PowerPoint is to put it somewhere else so you can actually look at it at your leisure. I want to talk not about the complexity of data, but just say one thing, that one of the worst things we can do is to only go on stereotypes, that here is a place that's socially advantaged, because we forget about those people who've got enormous mortgages. In fact, they might have borrowed 140% of the value of their property. And those people are in strife and may not know what's going to happen for the next week. But they've got all kinds of resources to break out of that. And then in a different part, we've got someone like Bill that Clare talked about. And so Bill might very well live in Western Sydney. He might not. But the problem with stereotyping is that it locks into other ideas we have about places. And still, in some of the books we read about basic urban geography, places like the outer suburbs of big cities are sometimes regarded as unrelieved landscapes of social disadvantage. They're not. There's millionaires, there's squillionaires, there's people on the dole, and there's people who don't know where the next meal is going to come from, literally. So what I want to talk about is not so much what's going on in the data and the complexity, but one or two rules to keep in mind. And one of them is access. One of the most uneven things around a city like Sydney for people's daily life is what they've got access to. They might be surrounded by jobs. And many people in Western Sydney, for example, are surrounded by quite a deal of job growth in the last decade. After all, the last decade has been one of the longest sustained growth periods in the Australian economy, since we've been adding figures up that way. But a study that we've completed with the Urban Research Centre at the University of Western Sydney tends to suggest that while lots of things have happened in Western Sydney, the overall structure of those places looks very much the same as it did before we had that decade of sustained economic growth. So maybe in that time when jobs were growing nationally, economic growth was taking place nationally, maybe there were some lost opportunities in that period when we could have put the current situation in a less vulnerable position than it might be to the sorts of changes that Raja and Clare have outlined. I notice I haven't got past the slide named Introduction. So I want to quickly unpack Sydney's urban economy and then move on to two examples. We've looked a lot about employment at the moment, and as Phil said, I want to talk about food security as well. Sydney has got this tag as being a global city. There are lots of things about Sydney that warrant this tag. It's a very important city on the world stage. It's been extremely important to that 10 years of growth in the Australian economy. But there's one problem with those labels, that if you say, well, does the city fit those labels? The answer is yes. But if you ask the question the other way around, do other cities fit those labels? The answer is almost yes too, because Melbourne has had a lot of these kinds of changes happen as well, so has Brisbane. The problem is in this economic geography stuff, there are very few either-or situations. Most of the thing you get is both. Is Western Sydney growing in industrial areas? Yes. Is Western Sydney declining in industrial areas? Yes. And the problem for planners, the problem for sometimes journalists, the problem sometimes for academic analysts is when you get those yes, yes answers to both your positive and your negative question, and those answers are sometimes in particular places, that a place is industrialising and deindustrialising at once, that's when planners start to glaze over. And you don't blame them for that. But somehow we've got to get beyond thinking, is Western Sydney either this or that? It's always growing, it's always going backwards. And what we see from time to time is the net effect of those changes. So, we're a global city, but I'm going to argue later on that the global city tag hasn't done Western Sydney in particular very many favours, because most people have an idea, or many people have an idea, that somehow the fast growth, the jazzy stuff, the stuff that's connected to the rest of the world, particularly through finance and business services, is happening in Eastern Sydney, in that arc that starts somewhere near Macquarie University, goes down through North Sydney, through the CBD and out to the airport, which is located much closer to the CBD than you'd find an airport of that size in most cities around the world. Well, it's true, but it's also true that some of the fastest growth from admittedly a smaller base in those jazzy finance, business services, technologically based activities is actually in Western Sydney. And it makes no sense at all to call Sydney a global city if we don't call the whole interacting network a global city. And there is a prevailing idea that somehow Western Sydney is stuck in the manufacturing sector, and indeed that graph will show that manufacturing has over a 30-year period moved, relatively speaking, from the old inner industrial areas around the port, around the airport, to the outer suburbs. 55% of manufacturing jobs by the 2006 census in the outer suburbs. But there's also growth in finance and business services, and we know that very well standing here in Parramatta tonight. So here's an issue then. Western Sydney as an outer area, social disadvantage in concentrations, has also growth. And if you look at the way the manufacturing sector has changed, we've had industrialisation in the outer suburban areas for the first time in the last decade, new industrial growth. But at the same time, Western Sydney shed jobs in the manufacturing sector all the way through that period of rapid economic growth in the last decade. So we're putting ourselves in a position where, with the recession, there will be further losses in the manufacturing sector. But I really want to point out here that the urban labour market operates in a complex kind of way. There isn't just one labour market. I think we've heard enough tonight already to know that there are lots of labour markets. Depends on which segment, which bit you get stuck in for a lot of people. And so there are numerous overlapping labour markets, and in a place like Sydney, they're very open. So it would be great to be able to move to jobs in your own region, your own locality. But sometimes you may have to move further. Household experiences are locally embedded in the way that I said before. Places do matter, and a lot of those resources that you take into the labour market with you have actually developed quite locally at your schools, in your house, with the experience of your family, with the kinds of information that are available to you.